Welcome to the Disciples Made February webinar. Today we're tackling a key challenge in disciple making about building intentional and trust-filled relationships that lead to transformation. Many disciple makers like us struggle to move beyond surface level connections or feel unsure about how those relationships differ from general friendships or mentoring. So in this conversation today, we're going to explore why trust and intentionality matter in disciple making and how to cultivate them, what makes disciple making relationships perhaps unique and different from other connections, practical steps to create environments where disciples can grow and confidently disciple others. And so, if we want to see true multiplication rather than just addition, we need to build strong, intentional relationships. So, welcome once again. My name is Jason Phelps. I am a coach with Disciples Made and also on the leadership team and operating as your host today. And so, I want to introduce my friends, my colleagues, other disciple makers on this journey with me. And Brian, let's go ahead and start with you. Let's go ahead and just tell people about who you are and what you do.
My name is Brian Phipps, and I am a disciple maker and the founder of Disciples Made, and the person that Jason most regularly gets frustrated with as he disrupts these calls at the last minute. So it's my job to keep people on their toes. No, I am one who took a long time in this disciple making thing to figure out what does vulnerability really look like and develops all that trust and whatnot. So I'm very excited about this, and I love the way that you set it up, Jason.
Absolutely. Well, it is an absolute pleasure to experience the fruit of your obedience to Jesus. So thank you, Brian, once again. It's an honor, even if you are a little much sometimes, but it's the
I'm
best
not
way
nearly
possible.
as bad as was if you look back at those early Disciples Made podcasts.
I love them.
I'm just trying to reproduce what he did. He was so good, and it made such great value to those experiences. But man, I was trying to keep things focused, and he's like, "Let's make this fun."
You did. It was a thoroughly enjoyable dynamic.
It was
that you, Rob, and the other Brian had in that season
we need
one.
to get him back on again soon. Holy cow!
We will. No, that'd be great. That'd be fun. That'd be fun to say the least. Well, Myra, let's go ahead and have you introduce yourself.
All right. I am a Myra Schrader. I am a disciple maker for many years and only recently transitioned to a disciple multiplier. Took me a long time to figure that out, but it has been a joy every step of the way. Many frustrations. My context is currently I am a volunteer at the church where I used to be on staff in discipleship, and I love being a volunteer and still getting to do just the incredible work of disciple making and mentoring other people along that same path. So much fun. Lots of ups and downs over the years. It's not a straight path, and so much 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. But as long as he keeps moving forward, I'll keep going. So love being here with you guys, and just, love the Fully Alive community.
Absolutely. Well, it's an absolute joy to have you on this journey with us, Myra. Thank you so much. Craig, let's go to you.
Well, I'm Craig Watson, and I am a disciple maker in North Texas, and really have relatively not been at this all that long. It hit me in 2020. I've been a believer for about 11 years, but it wasn't until about 2020 that the disciple multiplication bug bit me, and I have been a avid student and frustrated participant in that. Since then, it has been filled with joys and wonders and disappointments and just, the whole gamut of emotions. Mm-hmm. And I keep being reminded over and over again that it is just so much more important for me to be obedient in this journey than competent. And so I'm thankful for that, because I although I'm growing in my confidence, it still lacks. So I'm glad to be here with you guys. And again, just like you said, Jason, on this journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, super thankful, man, to have another Texan on this call and on this journey. And the pain points are real. I think I've dropped this quote before to you guys, but another disciple maker, multiplier, Dave Rhodes out of Snellville, Georgia. His quote always resonated with me, that, it's not whether you have the heart for disciple making and multiplication, it's whether or not you have the stomach for it. And so I've always resonated with that, because it's hard. It's not easy, and it's hard. but it's incredibly worth it to be able to see people step into their masterpiece mission and get to participate in the Great Commission, right? It's a beautiful thing. The first pain point that I want to talk about today for all the disciple makers and leaders that are listening in is this idea of relationships and the importance of relationships, regardless of your vocation, all this kind of stuff, whether, pastors, church staff, co-vocational, bivocational, marketplace leaders, just this idea about how important real and meaningful relationships are in our disciple making endeavors and relationships, and also our relationship with the Lord. And we have this, this word called vulnerability. And I know that it tends to be kind of a subject and a thing where sometimes we're not even sure if this is something that, if we're on church staff, what do our relationships with the people in our congregation look like? Can we build meaningful relationships and all these things? So today we're talking about vulnerability and relationships and disciple making. And so my first question that I want to throw to Craig is, why do you believe trust and intentionality are absolutely essential in disciple making relationships?
Well, I mean, ultimately, as we become closer to Jesus and better followers of him, and as we help guide other people into that, as we make disciples, there's some tough stuff, some hurt, and certainly hang-ups and habits that are some of them are just out and blatantly evident, but a lot of that stuff is buried deep. And whether they be wounds from when we were children, or victims of abuse, or even abusers ourselves, or suffering from bad relationships, bad marriages. There is, every one of us, almost I would say absolutely universal problem is that we have stuff. We've got baggage, we've got problems, and we live in a fallen world. And what we're trying to do is help people grow closer to Jesus and to release those things to his lordship. And we're called to repent of our sins. We're called to surrender those things to Jesus. And in order to do that, we have to be able to articulate them. We have to be able to point to them and say, this I give to you, Jesus. And a lot of times it's hard to do that ourselves. It's hard to look in the mirror and see some of those things. And it's really hard to let somebody else into that and to point those things out for us. But I would say that it's absolutely necessary.
Yes.
And so we are only willing to do that with people that we trust and people that we believe have a genuine concern and love for us. And so as we go on what can be at times a very just painful and journey, we need people that we know are going to turn those things around on us and to use them to hurt us or to take advantage of us or manipulate us in some way. So you just have to start with trust. And as disciple makers, we have to set the tone. We have to be an example of that. We just can't expect people to be vulnerable with us if we're not willing to do that with them. And so there's a certain amount of risk taking involved, right? We can't, if we're going to take the first step into vulnerability, then we kind of have to trust that this person that we're discipling is gonna be a good steward of that as well. And even though they're not as far along perhaps in their walk as we are. So absolutely,
That's powerful.
Absolutely important. I feel like you're waiting for me to say something else, but that's all I got at the moment. So.
I'm waiting. We can throw it to Brian or Myra.
I think what Craig just said is worth its weight in gold. I mean, that's true. My answer to this, I've jotted a couple of notes down, is why do we need this? To remain human. Craig just beautifully unpacked how we do that. So I can't add anything to that. The one thing I could add is, okay, what are the systems at play in churches that typically cause people to not be on that track, right? And there is a dynamic, particularly when you're an ordained pastor, but also to a certain degree, staff or key volunteer, where you're kind of forced by the system, kind of your own willingness to let this go here, but also kind of an interesting dynamic that comes from the other people in the church, that all of a sudden you have to be a more perfect example of Jesus in our midst than people that aren't in a position like that. And that's a hellish temptation or spot to fall into. I do remember when I was an ordained pastor in a traditional denomination for 15 years, it was a very real problem that nobody knew a solution to other than figuring out how I can go and find those relationships with people that aren't in my church, whether that be pastors of another church in the denomination, a friend outside. It gets hard to find those people because you spend so much time with the people at church. And the breakdown there is I'm not offering real disciple making in my church because no one knows my life. And a one-sided discipleship relationship isn't a discipleship relationship at all. It requires that vulnerability, which requires that trust in order to share real brokenness, right? And here's the real problem. If you live in that isolation of, I'm kind of the Jesus icon, I've fallen into that trap, is if you don't have a place to go to deal with your own brokenness, which Craig very well pointed out we all have, then you have to fake it. And the more you have to fake it, the wall that grows between who you actually are and the personification that you're putting forward is going to be the thing that creates the downfall that may make headlines depending on how big your church is. And we've seen enough of that to say, that's over. Like, that's way too much. We're discrediting the beauty and the power of Jesus by falling into temptations like that. So the importance of this conversation for disciple making and just maintaining our integrity as men and women who represent Jesus in the leadership of his church are absolutely at stake. Now, there's a how to do that we need to get into, and how some of our approaches to this help facilitate that. But I'm sure Myra has additional insights as to why this is so important.
As I think about it and consider, there's an importance in terms of intentionality in modeling. If I'm going to disciple people, I need to model what's going to be healthiest and best for them. If I don't trust them enough to be honest about my struggles, my brokenness, my junk, then it's going to tell them that they shouldn't have those kinds of things going on either, or at least that they can't own up to those things. And as Craig pointed out, we've got to be able to repent, and we can't repent if we don't own the problems and the brokenness. And so that's just that modeling is such a critical thing. The things that I model are the things that I can reproduce. And if I model something false, if I model something fake, if I put up walls, that's what I'm going to be teaching those that I've invited to follow me to do.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of that present. So it's a real problem to fix.
It's such a human thing to do those things and to protect ourselves. Having worked closely with pastors over the years, and I think the thing that horrified me most was when I heard one of them say, well, at seminary, they told us we should not have relationships with the people in our congregation. And it broke my heart. If you can't have that open, honest, who I am, know and be known kind of relationship with the people in your own congregation, that is just a poverty of the system. So yeah,
it is. And it begs the question, what's the alternative path?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm assuming that there's a continuum. There's too much vulnerability too fast. There's too little vulnerability that doesn't allow for real healthy stuff, which kind of takes us to the how does this get done? Are you ready to go there, Jason, or do you have something else?
No, go for it.
As I was thinking through this, I had two kind of words to create a framework. You need to have the right environment to be vulnerable, and you need to have the right pace in developing that vulnerability. Those two words make an awful lot of sense to me. So one of the things that Jesus modeled that we also model in our intentional disciple making environments, particularly at the influence level cohort, is space for the 1 to 3, like Jesus had that with Peter, James, and John. All the most intimate moments were with the 3, not the 12. That's interesting. Now, Jesus was also very intentional with the 12, but there's less vulnerability and less intimate moments were shared with the 12. And that tells us a lot about the environment. Pastors, leaders, you should probably not share extremely vulnerable brokenness during a Sunday sermon. That's in the 72. And you probably should not do it in the 12 most of the time. I'm not saying never, none of this is that, but it's within the 3, you and a few others that are trusted, that are committed to this type of thing together. That's the place to be able to share that. So when it comes to environment, it's the 1 to 3, maybe 1 to 12 later, probably never the 72. And in fact, if you don't ever, here's the thought, if you don't ever share it in a proper environment, you might be forced to have that story shared in the larger environment. When the video comes out saying about how you've messed up and you're no longer in your position. So right environment, right pace. To me, the pace on this, even in the 1 to 3, is a lot like putting your toes in a pool to check the temperature. Is it too cold? Is it too hot? You don't just jump right in without checking. When it comes to pace, I like to share I want to take the lead as a leader in a church, in a discipleship relationship, whether it's mentoring one-on-one or in the 1 to 12 type of things. I want to share a little bit of vulnerability in my life and see how responsible the people, the other 2 or 3 are in that triad with that information. If they respond with encouragement and support instead of condemnation, and if they keep it confidential. Right. Those are the things I'm looking for. But then if they do that, then I'll share a little bit more vulnerable and, risky ongoing. So it's just like as I would measure the temperature of a pool before I start to really immerse myself, it's the same way with that. So the right environment, right pace, disclose a little bit at a time. Trust breeds trust. And by the way, this is why longer cohorts in disciple making are needed to really develop this, because that vulnerability takes time to develop, and that's what we want these people to have ongoing.
Yeah. I would add to what you said, Brian. The scripture that comes to mind is when Jesus was talking to his disciples and he said, I have so much more to teach you, but you're not ready. Testing the waters. Are they ready for this? And knowing who they are. The other thing that is a word that just has been coming to me over the past probably 2 weeks in my Bible engagement, and that is discretion. And I even went and looked up, okay, discretion. I know what it means, but what's it mean? And, it was choosing what you say and what you speak for the good of the other. And so I think a really important part of this is having that discretionary relationship with the people that we're discipling, and they with us, and knowing, trust requires it. Do I know that this person is only going to say and do what's good for me and not just what's good for someone else?
Love it.
And I know for me personally, I've got, and within Disciples Made, we call that 1 to 3 relationship a triad, where we along with 2 other people in especially like Brian said, the influence level cohorts, you have 2 other people that you're experiencing this journey with, that you share that greater level of intimacy. And I've been through a number of cohorts now, and so I've been in quite a few triads. And so every time I go through a new cohort, I'm in a new triad. And so I get better at that experience. But what I've also found that's valuable for me, just as a disciple maker that is going through these cohorts multiple times, is that I need a life triad, right? There's a couple of guys that I go to when I've got the stuff that's developmentally happening right now, and so those are the guys that I confide in, that I've got a high level of trust with them. Brian was talking about this history of trust being, bringing about trust. We have been through some stuff together, and they've earned my trust. They have my trust. I trust them with every part of me, and I can go to that last 2% with them, right? But in the triads, the new triads that I establish as we go through these cohorts, the best thing that I really have to offer them is I don't have that last 2% with them, because actually kind of where I am and revealing, those are digging down to that stuff is probably, they're not ready for that in my relationship. Our relationship isn't ready for that, kind of like what you were talking about, Myra. But I've got my life triad for that. I've got those guys but with them, the best thing that I have to offer them is the experience that I had when I was where they were, right? So when
Oh,
they were wrestling with whatever it is that they're wrestling with, that I've got a similar experience that I can point back to and say, let me tell you how that was with me, and what it meant to not only open up about that, but how God healed me in that, and how the triad of guys that I was going through at the time really helped me navigate those waters. And so I think that's an important nuance, I suppose. As we just disciple, we're not just discipling 3 people indefinitely, right? We're moving on. We're discipling other people as the people that we've previously discipled go on to disciple folks. So how do you manage that triad over time, that continued vulnerability? So I just felt like that was an important component of that, at least for me and in my journey.
very important. I use the term, this is my transcendent triad. I've got the triad that I'm regularly engaging with, but I've got that triad that just stays until one of us, one of them just passes away or whatever. It's like they're it, because it's hard to get those. It's hard to cultivate that level of trust. Craig, real quick, describe what the last 2% means in case somebody didn't get clarity on that.
Well, so there's some stuff that like for me that I've struggled with in my past that I'm over, and I'm happy to talk about that and in just about any forum with anybody. And then there's a level of stuff that kind of like what you were talking about, Brian, with the 12 or with a small group. I'm happy to share those kind of things, but there's some stuff that that I'm just not going to tell anybody, or just that is so deep and so raw, and so it challenges so much who I am or who I think I am, or the pains that I've experienced, that I can't bear to give that to just anybody. It has to be only with those very few people, those people that I do just trust with ultimately my life, that I can give them those most vulnerable parts of me, and they're going to handle them with care. And that's really that last 2% that I'm talking.
I heard a great word from a friend who I got to meet throughout an exponential cohort, and his name's Chris Brooks. And that guy is probably one of my favorite people. I think after I met him, I told my wife that I met my spirit animal. He's a fellow bearded gentleman, and honestly, just an incredible guy that I needed for that moment in time. And we had asked him a question about disciple multiplication and what is the number one thing, if they're like, just like that gold nugget, the silver bullet, the secret sauce. I mean, if there is such a thing, we
Wow,
were
we need
looking
a
for.
few more cliches, Jason. Come on, you can
Hey,
dig them up.
I'm just proving my point here. So we asked him, we said, what is that one thing that we need to make sure that we do? And in only the way that he could do it, he turned to the side and he put his hands on his side, turned to us, and he said, "You got to show your flank." That was his one answer. If there was one thing that we can do to successfully multiply disciples to the 4th generation and create a culture of disciple making and multiplication in our context, it was that. It was vulnerability. It was the leader showing the flank. And that was just profound for me.
I'll tell you what, I think that is about the most brilliant answer that could be given. And I want to substantiate it with the fact that up until I met my mentor, apart from my father, my most prized mentor is Dan Sutherland. And up until that, I had never seen vulnerability from a pulpit, appropriate vulnerability. I'd seen too much, too fast, and I'd seen way too little most of the time. Going back to what Myra said about you're kind of trained in seminary, put a bar or put a wall between you and the congregation or whatnot. So that's what I saw the most. But I saw this vulnerability in Dan that was very appropriately open. And what it did for the church that we were a part of, here's 5,000 plus, 5,000 people or so on a weekend. It created permission throughout the entire congregation for people to be vulnerable as a default setting. It's like the pastor or primary leader, through their own vulnerability or not, turn the switch on and off about whether or not vulnerability is okay. And his unique leadership, just admitting his own brokenness, sharing areas where he didn't meet the expectations of Scripture on occasion as he was teaching, just created the rest of us like, hey, well, if he's struggling, I can admit that I'm struggling. And that becomes more a part of the DNA in small groups and discipleship, other discipleship environments and stuff like that. So I totally agree with your friend, Chris. And I'm glad you met your spirit animal who gave you the silver bullet and the bee's knees and whatever,
all the, hey, all
all
the
the
above,
things,
all the
all the
above.
things.
I want to ask another question because I can only imagine, like, for people that are listening to our conversation, they're like, yeah, that's great, but, and so I think that, there's definitely some fear in this just because of, the culture that is in, what we've called the church industrial complex before. It's like, well, that's great. I would love to be vulnerable, but still, just not being able to trust. And so I think that how we can segue into this next question is being able to differentiate between intentional disciple making relationships and how they differ from general friendships or mentoring relationships, and maybe what key elements set them apart. So I think sometimes disciple makers often feel unsure about how their relationships should look, or how they could look, or how they could differ from other types of connections. And so just to be able to bring some clarification to those listening. So Myra, I'd love to hear from you just what kind of perspective that you come with, that what makes intentional disciple making relationships unique and perhaps different just from general friendships.
As I thought about that question a little bit earlier, the thing that came to mind for me is just the importance of prayer in those kinds of relationships. It's not that I wouldn't pray with my friends and things like that, but that focus of that prayer is very geared towards helping one another grow as followers of Jesus. I would ask deeper questions about character and have greater expectations about character, and hope and give permission for my discipling partner to ask those same questions about me. And I often in my triad, but also when I'm leading a group, I give permission and actually ask them if they see me showing less than the character that I'm calling for or called to as a disciple, please call me out. So there's that permission to challenge. I'm going to hold on to challenge for a minute, but that permission to call out my character and again, to model how we do that in such a way that it is not an accusation, but a challenge to be something better. And so I think another key part of that relationship and interaction is the ability to challenge. I was talking with one of my second generation disciple makers a few weeks ago, and she says, "You can challenge people. I'm not good at that yet." And I said, to be a disciple maker, that's just a critical skill to be able to challenge people. And I said, all you have to do is remember that you want something more. You want the best for them. And then to challenge becomes just an expression of love.
That's really good. And Myra, what you said earlier, so I didn't mean to cut you off, but it looked like you kind of hit a pause point there. What you said earlier, it's all in creating the expectations on the front end. Like our goal in this IDE is significant growth in character and calling. That's going to require feedback. So by you joining, you're basically signing the disclaimer that you want that as well.
Yes.
And so that creates the rules, they're very spoken rules of engagement that welcome that because it's a benefit. And Jason, you're asking about the difference between that and just a friendship. Well, that friendship may not have defined goals. If it does, great. And if they share the same goals of developing character and calling with those same rules of engagement, then there's not much difference at all. But I know for me personally, as a disciple maker, I'm always on as a disciple maker, but there's times that I just don't want to be on for anything. And my list of friends where I could just go golf and be a storky middle schooler for a little while. I mean, I just love doing that. And I'd love to giggle and just be not worrying about what people think. There's a set of friends that is a very limited group of people that kind of just do the same with me. And that is not necessarily a growth thing. We're certainly boundaries where we have like, dude, that was stupid. You shouldn't do that. And I've got that in my friendships, but there's a different goal there. And that's called rest and replenishment in a recreational type of environment. So I hope that that's just helpful in kind of pointing out the difference between intentional relationships and IDEs versus just friendships in general. It'd be best, I think, for your friendships to be the best of both worlds.
How would it redefine your friendships if you were always helping them? Like if you're always, you said you're always on as a disciple maker, Brian, but we know that when you define the relationship with other disciple makers, they've given us permission. And Myra, I love that you use that word. We've defined the
Great word.
relationship. We've been given mutual permission throughout this intentional journey. And so Brian, if you were to take how you treat those intentional disciple making relationships and impose those upon those friends you go golfing with, how would that change the nature of those relationships?
Well, you're kind of getting in a little bit to what's the difference now between IDE type things and friendships and mentors, because I would think that just by the nature of my age and the level of influence that I've had in most of my friendships, that most of my friends would also, that I can have that crazy cut up time with, would also consider me a mentor to them. So it kind of crosses into that as well. But if I was to things, I think I don't really understand the question. If I tried to impose something on them, how would it change it? It would probably to a certain extent tighten up or make the loosey-goosiness, become more constrained and less fun, I think, because I need those environments of where it's just kind of off. And I don't mean off to just have some type of, free for all. There's no character formation necessary or no responsibility to reflect the character of Jesus and whatnot. I'm not saying that at all. There's a basement line where behavior goes into ungodly that I would say are the standards instead of pushing us forward, in that environment. I just want to play golf and have a good time. And I've got a base of character that I want to demonstrate in that process, but I don't want to use that golf moment to push you forward in character and calling. Does that make sense? Like if I did that, yeah.
That's what I was hoping you would say. Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, Myra.
I think that, the difference too is the intentionality, is my intention that I'm always, that everything I'm engaged in is to grow this person, or is my intention to just, let's be us, let's enjoy our time together. There's a difference in that. And I can do that with people that I'm discipling. And sometimes I cross between friend and the disciple maker. It's that intentionality of, and sometimes it's just the environment that you're in, that, we agree that we're going to go into this space and we're just going to share coffee. We're going to talk about whatever kinds of things come to mind. And like Brian said, you maintain that base of what it is to be a Christian friend, but you're not pushing into the growth. And if I'm trying to do that all the time, I had a great conversation with my Followers Made group this week about the joys of being in a triad where I didn't feel like I was having to lead and model every single moment, because the women in my triad are more at the same level of spiritual maturity that I am. And so it's just been a joy. It's been a different kind of joy, but it's been a welcome respite, I think, from always feeling like I needed to push and pull.
Craig, I know you got some truth bombs ready to go, but I got to get something out real quick beforehand.
Go for it.
As Myra's talking, I'm realizing, even though I don't feel that I'm on when I'm on the golf course, I really am. And you can never lose that. You can never have this gap between who you really are when you're in your role of disciple maker and when you're not. But the richer the friendship, or the more free the friendship, the more free, you know how they say your real self is who you are when no one's looking, that little statement. Well, friendship, and in those moments right there where you don't feel like you're on or trying to prove anything, are the chances where it's easiest to let your stupid out with somebody else looking, I have found. And I'm seeing Craig I've seen everybody kind of giggle a little bit saying, okay, yeah, well, I might not be off base. And if that happened with me, then I would expect one of the other guys, and they do this, which is beautiful, to come back and later and say, hey, Phipps, I didn't say this when we were on the golf course, but when you did X, Y, and Z, that just wasn't your best. And I've done that with other guys as well, because it's the same for them when we're a little bit more loose and just being and not trying to be with a certain whatever it is. Then, it creates opportunity for disciple making conversations later that are actually richer, perhaps, than intentional ones in an IDE, because they're coming off of a true proven chemistry and history and all the things that friendships contribute. So I had to get that off, Craig. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're good. You're good. One of the things that I was just thinking about, though, is that not all my friends, and I would hope not all of our friends, are actually believers. And so, it's a different kind of relationship there. And when we disciple people, just like Myra, you were talking about, and Brian, you said, there's a level of expectation there, that their expectation of me, but also my expectation of them. I'm not gonna throw somebody in the trunk of a car and take them on some journey, that they didn't ask for. That's called kidnapping, right?
Which we could consider as a stress.
It's so, I mean, they need to be in on this, right? And in fact, they need to be as at least concerned about their relationship with Jesus as I am. And they need to be willing to commit to some things that are going to be expected throughout this journey. And I don't have that same expectation for friends. If they ask for that, then I'm gonna provide that. But if I have, for example, an unbelieving friend, and I'm thinking of someone that actually right now, and we have really great conversations, and some of those are spiritual conversations, but I am not going to do the spiritual equivalent of him throwing him in the trunk and taking them on this journey. At some point, I truly believe that God has started a work in him, that he is opening his eyes and his heart to a potential relationship with Jesus. And I hope I'm there, on that day when he says, you know what, I think I want to go on a journey with you, and I'll let him in the passenger seat and we'll take that ride. Right. But I think it's important that at least with discipling, that in a distinction from a friendship or even a mentor relationship, is that we understand the objectives. We understand what it is that we're after. And just like you were talking about, Brian, we're all in agreement of what it's going to take, and we're willing to go down that road in order to do it.
Oh, good.
I think all of this stuff just reemphasizes why real and meaningful relationships are so important, right? Right. I absolutely love it. Let's get practical for just a little bit. What practical steps can we take to actually create these environments where relationships are deepened and disciples feel equipped to disciple others? Craig, what do you think? I'd love to throw that to you first.
So whenever I first realized, and I can't speak about it other than just a revelation from Jesus, that I am here to disciple people. But when I received that, I didn't have any tools to do that with. I didn't know how to go about it. I knew that's what he wanted me to do, but I didn't know really what that was. And so almost simultaneously, I met you, Brian, and was exposed to you, your thoughts, ideas, and the tools that you made available through Disciples Made. And I almost without looking just jumped into facilitating a Followers Made. And it was within that context that I really saw for the first time what it looked like to disciple. And I was amazed at how much I learned in that process. But it kind of gave me a framework. Well, it didn't just kind of. It absolutely gave me a framework in the context of an intentional disciple making environment where I could put into practice the things that I was being taught through that experience, but then also able to overlay that more broadly into life and use the things I was learning as I facilitated, people going through Followers Made, to how I led my family, how I interacted with my wife, how I, handled myself and managed my relationships at work. And so there are elements of what we do as disciple makers that just have much broader application than just within those relationships or those experiences.
Mara, what do you think?
Yeah. So I think the way we create the environment is really critical. And there are, over my time on staff in discipleship, even before I came on staff and was just leading a women's Bible study, there were things in the environment that we've talked about here already, the vulnerability. I think, but you have to be intentional in terms of meeting together regularly. If you're not going to do that, you're not going to develop a relationship. So there's that being there for one another. That's so important. There's again, the vulnerability, the centering it all in the word and looking out for one another. I think too, recognizing that everybody brings something really important and really critical. One of the things that I love most about when we invite people into our intentional discipling environments is we ask for a commitment because we let them know that what they bring is just as valuable as what I bring.
So, for sure.
And so I think that's that mutual respect and bringing a mutual gift from the Spirit that we each do is really an important thing. If I go to a Bible study where a teacher teaches me and I always feel like I'm the learner, always grabbing, always taking, I don't get the sense that there's something more that I can do. So I think that fosters that idea that I'll never know enough to be a disciple maker. So I want to create an environment where we disciple one another. And so in that safe space, we learn how to do that in a really healthy, positive way. And I think our intentional discipling environments do that in such a beautiful way, from those explore courses to the influence cohorts, and then or the influence courses, and then even into our multiplication and coaching cohorts. There's always that interplay between facilitator and participants. And what everybody brings is just considered valuable.
Absolutely. We talk about the intentional disciple making environments and just these ingredients of it. And we often talk about, the outcome focused, habit fueled, and content flavored. But we have the other two. And I know, Craig, you often talk about this in the imagery of a table. And I'd love to pass that to you in a second. But it's just that this is forged in community. And I'm a huge proponent of joy. That I think joy changes things. Joy allows us to learn. Joy connects us. Joy is multiplied as we get to share that joy with one another. And so I think creating these IDEs into high joy environments where everybody that is in our presence is able to say, I don't want to be anywhere else but with you right now. And that is something that is profound and creates just that high joy environment where people are ready to be vulnerable, that people are ready to learn, and it just changes the whole posture. Craig, I'd love to hear from you.
You're talking about what I like to call a missional table, and it's really just the elements of an IDE as I learned them from Brian, but it makes, in the context in which we use it in some of the men's activities that we do where we are, it helps in explaining it and sharing the concepts. But ultimately, just like you said, well, okay, so a table generally, has four legs, and one of those legs is, if when we're talking about it in the context of a missional table, is outcomes. And so we are the outcomes that we're looking for are character and calling, that we're growing, to become more like Christ as time goes on, and that we're understanding our calling. We're better understanding why we've been uniquely created and redeemed. So those are our outcomes. And then we've got that, we call it habit fueled. So our next leg of the table is our habits. And what are those spiritual habits that we're engaging in that help us reach our outcomes and help us live more like Jesus would? So our, reading the Bible, but not just reading it for information, but reading it for transformation. So we've got some specific techniques that we use within that, our prayer, and not just supplications, but are we listening? Or when we're seated in heavenly places with our Lord, are we listening to what he has to say? And so are those spiritual habits, and there's obviously more of those, but just like you said, Jason, that community is the next leg, that this stuff happens within the context of community. I don't think you can experience love or joy or peace or those things in isolation. I think that we experience those things best when we're with other people, and specifically other believers, and we're playing our part in this process of being Christ-like, and helping other people do the same. And the final leg is content. And something that, Brian, you've said over and over, you've beat this drum, of content is king. That's often the way that we've approached that, within our as we've taken on an educational model in our churches, that content is important, but it's not king in an intentional disciple making environment. So it is one of the legs of the table. And we use that content to help us as we go on this journey. So, and certainly some of that's biblical, but some of it's extra biblical. And so there are smart people who love God that have authored wonderful things over the course of time that we can apply to our learning. And ultimately, those things, the legs of the missional table, the legs of any table, exist to do what? To provide a surface, for which we eat or we do work or whatever it is. And the tabletop and this explanation is mission, that all of those things exist to support the mission. And we all have a primary mission. We were given that in the Great Commission to go and make disciples. So we have this primary mission that we're all in together to go and make disciples. And we probably also have a secondary mission that we've realized through our calling that may be launching us in a specific direction. And all of this is, and perhaps most important part is that the table sits on the foundation of the gospel. Without the gospel, none of this stuff is even, it's not even relevant. And so that's kind of a brief, explanation of what I like to call the missional table. But ultimately, it's the key components of an intentional disciple making environment.
Beautiful. Brian, I'm looking at you.
Well, I've got a big thought, but the thought is basically pulling the camera way back up and looking down on this last question. If the mission, picking up where Craig left off, is to multiply disciples, what we've kind of unpacked so far in this webinar is that requires meaningful, reciprocal, and vulnerable relationships, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're asking, what practical steps can we take to create environments where those relationships are present so that real disciple making and therefore multiplication can actually happen? And I would say the most practical thing that we can do to deepen these relationships is learn how to have awkward conversations. Like, just to back it way up, it's hard to talk about things that shame is associated with. It's hard to talk about anything that has anything to do with perceived disappointment in self or others. We usually try to avoid those conversations because we just don't know how to have them. And so embedded, like Myron talked about this and Craig talked about this, embedded in all of these elements that make up our IDEs are regular questions and accountability practices that learn you how to have more difficult conversations over the course of a 6 to 9 month experience. And like, for instance, even our accountability process, if you start to fall behind, it's not did you do it or not do it? It's, here were your goals, and we phase it into this kind of, we encourage you, and then we entreat you, and then we enforce, like, just how to have solid accountability relationships, or to back it back up, to have those awkward conversations and learn how to have them well, takes the anxiety out of having those conversations, which enables you to actually successfully have them. And quite honestly, to me, whatever group of people in the world, whether it be a small group all the way up to a nation or a government in a nation, whatever group of people can effectively have awkward conversations in a way that keeps relationships intact and provokes or invites growth of everyone involved and a mutual beneficial win, are the people that will win ultimately. Because relationships will either cause division or they'll cause unity and marching forward. And so really, you want to get practical about it, learn how to have hard conversations. And that, all you can do to do that is step into them and just say, I'm new at this. I get anxious. My breathing's too shallow right now. My heart rate's up to about 180, but I'm forging into this thing, definitely afraid, because I know that genuine relationships will be on the other side as I learn how to do this better, and the energy leaves so that I can step into it with more confidence and peace and assurance that Jesus is speaking with me, just like he did for Moses back in the time of approaching Pharaoh. Like, what if we had the mind of Christ guiding these conversations and producing meaningful outcomes for everybody involved? That's how we get there, I think.
Myra, as we wrap up today, if there was one thing that you wanted to leave other disciple makers listening to this episode, what would that be?
I think it would be look to Jesus' example and know that he has gone before you and he is right there beside you. Yeah, just, his promise when he told us to make disciples was ended with, and lo, I'm with you always. Don't be afraid.
Greg, what about you?
I think that we have a tendency to overcomplicate things. And I think that we often, at least my impression of what a disciple maker was before I became one, is that you had to have a certain education or be seminary trained or something like that if you were really going to do good work as a disciple maker. And that is simply not true. All of God's people are called to this. It's part of who we are, part of our identity. We are disciple makers. And just like if you're a parent, you are a parent. That's part of who you are. It's the definition of who you are. And you figure out how to do that even when you don't know quite how. You find resources. You ask people that you respect. You just lean into the hard times. That's the same thing that we are as disciple makers. And so that's who you are as a disciple maker. And we have resources. There are tons of resources, but just do it. Just get out there and start leaning into it and ask for help when you need it. And I guarantee you, you will get the help that you ask for.
Solid advice.
Love it. We all have influence in other people's lives. And like you said, Craig, that we keep beating the drum of obedience is greater than competence. And Jesus can do so much more with small steps of obedience than he can when we try and think we can do it all on our own. So thank you guys for being here with us today. For all of you who have chimed in and listening, we hope that you've gotten at least some bit of clarity on what relationships can look like in intentional disciple making, as well as just the importance of vulnerability. I think from all of us here is that we can say that it is worth it. If you need help with next steps, go to disciplesmade.com/training, that we are here for you, to walk with you. And that the beauty is that we are not alone in this. And sometimes the best thing we can do is, before we innovate and try to figure it out on our own, we just need someone else to imitate who's gone before us. And so we love you. Thank you for being with us today. And we can't wait to see what God can do in, through, and beyond you as we multiply missional disciple makers who are living fully alive.